Yeah, I'm really excited to be introducing Dr. Heather Yocum, who, like Drew said, traveled up from Colorado to join us today. So a little background, Heather is the research scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences and is the lead social scientist at North Central Climate Adaptation Center, which are both housed under the University of Colorado Boulder. And Heather grew up in Golden, Colorado, and then she attended the University of Denver for her bachelor's in international studies. I knew. Yeah. Apparently at the same time as Drew. We didn't know each other.
So many mutual friends, though.
Yeah. She then went on to Michigan State University for her master's and PhD in cultural anthropology. A recent project she worked on was the Grassland Synthesis Project in the Northern Great Plains region. And some fun facts about Heather is she has 2 kids and 2 almost identical gray cats. That not many people can tell the difference between the cats. And today she is presenting to us a presentation called "There's an Anthropologist in My Science, Interdisciplinary Attempts to Advance Climate Adaptation Science." So please welcome Heather.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be up here. And I actually have not given an in-person presentation since late 2019 before the pandemic funds. I was like, wow, it's like exciting and also kind of weird to be talking to actual people instead of just like little Zoom boxes. And hello to the people on Zoom. So yeah, I guess be gentle if I'm like super weird or start doing like weird things. My social muscle isn't necessarily what it was before the pandemic. So I have shamelessly used this title in a bunch of different talks that I've given, mostly to interdisciplinary audiences. And yeah, because sometimes people are like, why is there a qualitative social scientist like hanging around with all the climate scientists or the physical scientists? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing here? And before I kind of lob into my talk, I'd actually like to get to know you all a little bit. So like, I don't know, maybe like show of hands, like other social scientists in the room. Yes, awesome. Okay. It's so fun. I never get to talk to this many social scientists. This is great, but I love all of the folks. So like ecology, engineering, what are we? Okay.
Hydrology.
Sorry?
Hydrology.
Awesome, excellent. I got a little hydro in here, so.
Got a botanist, right? Yeah.
Biophysics.
Okay. Okay. I don't know, like soil, do we got like soil science people? I don't know, like.
Oh, I'm doing like sustainable tourism development.
Oh, okay, so yeah, we're very interdisciplinary.
House.
Okay, sweet. It just kind of helps me to know a little bit about, who I'm talking to. And
Our wildlife contingent is all at the International Wildlife Meeting right now. So we usually have a strong wildlife science.
Gotcha. I was gonna say, I was like, not a single ecologist?
Yeah.
Like what's going on? Okay. There we go. So before I go any further, my awesome 2 kids and my awesome 2 cats, as they mentioned. So there they are. They're all adorable. But yeah, so I am a qualitative social scientist. And so I primarily kind of approach all of my research in thinking about sort of how people interact with nature or the non-human world or the environment, kind of whatever term you want to use, and how we create information about that. So how we learn about it, how we create data, how we use the data, how we try to manage natural spaces or non-human spaces. And that comes a lot from science and technology studies. So that's one of kind of the places where I plant my feet. The other one is really kind of from a more like political ecology and environmental justice perspective. Whoops. So thinking about kind of like who benefits from climate adaptation or how we make and use climate information or environmental science information. So who benefits, who doesn't benefit, and then who gets to decide or kind of who's at the table as we're making those things. So I think as a researcher, it's really important to kind of say where your kind of standpoint is or kind of where you're situated. And it gives you guys just a better idea of sort of how and why I might ask particular questions or use particular methods or analyze my data in particular ways. And so this is a very nascent figure, so don't hold me to it. But at the Climate Adaptation Science Center, we think a lot about actual climate science and useful and usable science. And so we kind of like to sit right up here in thinking about how social science, climate science, and ecological science, or really social processes, climate processes, and ecological processes all interact to create these social environmental systems. So I feel like I'm in really good company with the folks in this room on that. And more recently in the social science part of the cast, we've been thinking a lot about this, kind of this learning loop of how we actually create useful or actionable science that like climate scientists or physical and weather scientists can create, and then how it can actually be used by natural resource managers or policy folks or other people who really want to use that science to make decisions or manage for species or habitats or things like that. And so we've kind of done a lot of work in here, and you'll hear about some of that shortly. But we also do a lot with, or we want to start kind of moving more this way. So thinking about like, once we've actually made that hopefully useful, usable, actionable science, how do people actually use it? Does it get into their adaptation plans? And if it does get into those adaptation plans, what does it do? Does it actually help them move towards climate adaptation or climate smart management of those systems, of those species, of those habitats, things like that? So we're thinking about that. And then also thinking about like, how do we actually study that? Like, how do we actually study adaptation, which is really, really hard for lots of reasons, because you kind of have to think about what would have happened without it, which isn't necessarily something that you've got this counterfactual you're trying to kind of compare reality against. And so we're thinking kind of about a lot of this. So this is sort of where my research kind of comes from and also where it's going. So now that I've said all of that, I want to kind of take you back and kind of go kind of a mile wide and an inch deep on a couple of different projects that I've worked on over the last 10 years at CU. That really just kind of like, what can you do with qualitative social science and all of this? Beyond kind of some of the more obvious things, like adaptation planning or looking at vulnerability assessments, like what can we really do? So if we have time, oh, and I meant to start my timer. Do we have a clock somewhere? I can get my phone out.
You do.
Okay, can you like wave me down at 35? Because
Sure.
I'm trying to talk to you until about 40 after.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
So yeah, so if I have time, I'll go through all 5. If not, we'll skip one. But the West Climb project, which is really a user needs assessment and applications of hydroclimate data in the Prairie Potholes region, which is the northern part of the North Central region. The Evaporative Demand Drought Index, which is a evaporation tool basically. And we did a lot of like user-based design, research to operations and tool development, state wildlife action plans. So we were looking at how you can evaluate how they use climate information in those plans, and then how they actually use that in adaptation planning. The Grassland Synthesis Project, which is one of our more recent ones, is looking at decision-making, context, research gaps, and then synthesizing available climate and ecological information for grassland managers across a 7-state region, which includes Colorado and Wyoming. And I'll get into all of these in a minute. And then finally, the Cross Park RAD project, and RAD is Resist, Accept, Direct. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a minute, whether people are familiar with it or not. But we're really interested in thinking about how emotions and institutional context inform adaptation decision making, because it's not always about the data or the climate science that we have available. So the West Climb project. So this is actually the project that first brought me to CU as a postdoc way back in early 2014. And so we were working in the Prairie Pothole region, which you can see here. And the reason that it's really important for fish and wildlife managers is because it's where a lot of the small migratory waterfowl on the continent breed. So if you've ever like seen a mallard duck, they probably came from here. 70 to 90% of mallard ducks breed in this region. And so do like other small waterfowl, like teals and pintails and all those like really awesome, beautiful birds. That's where they are. And so I was part of an interdisciplinary team that really wanted to look at applications of basically how climate was going to impact precipitation, because these wetlands, some of them are permanent, some are semi-permanent, some are ephemeral, some really only come like in a really, really, really wet year. But they're vital breeding habitat for these birds. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to the precip in this part of the world. So we talked to a lot of folks because we really wanted to understand, how do we turn climate and hydroclimate data into meaningful information for these managers so that they could make their decisions. So we wanted to connect the scientists that were making the science with the folks that were actually using the science. And we wanted to understand like what information do the natural resource managers up there actually need and when do they need it? Because you can give them the best information available, but if you get it to them late when they've already made a decision about, hunting limits or something like that for the season, or how they're going to treat like nest studies and stuff for the region, then it doesn't matter because it's late. It's almost like it wasn't there. And then co-production again to try to kind of connect the practitioner community with the research community. So in talking to folks, we really wanted to understand the whole decision-making context, right? So like what were their challenges? What are they actually trying to do when they're managing all of these habitats and like trying to manage for these waterfowl? What they really wanted to know was like, how much water are we going to have on this landscape? How persistent is this going to be? When is it going to be here? So is it going to stick around long enough for the ducks to fledge their babies? And where to kind of prioritize future like conservation easements and investments and things like that. And then what climate information to actually use to help them understand that. So this is one of my favorite quotes ever. It's misattributed to Henry Ford, but like if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, not a car. And in the same way, like you can't always just ask like a fish and wildlife biologist that works in like a state agency, what climate information you need. Like, tell me what climate info you want, which DCM do you want to use? Some of them will tell you, some of them know, they're very savvy. They'll be like, we need a 1 kilometer downscaled model that's, relevant out to like, that's accurate out to 2100. You're like, well, we can't do that, but here's what we can do. And other times they just kind of say, there's so much, I have no idea where I would even start. And so that's where understanding the context of the decision-making context really comes in. So you'll get people that say something like this. If you ask them like, what's a good year look like? What's a bad year look like? What's your worst year look like weather-wise? And they'll say something like, if you get 3 inches of rain in 1 month, then it doesn't rain in July and August, and it's going to be really dry. And a lot of those really important ponds are going to dry up before the ducks are ready. And so for our climate team, we could tell them, okay, we need days without rain. So, and we also need like timing of precip. So don't give us the precip that's averaged over 3 months, June, July, August. It's much more helpful if you can break it down month by month, especially for these managers. So we can just kind of communicate that kind of information to them. So some of the folks on our team, they used what we found from our interviews and kind of our participant observation and just hanging out with all these folks to make predictive models for May pond count. Because basically the number of ponds that they have in May is highly correlated to basically how many ducks and waterfowl are going to be able to fledge their babies and for duck recruitment. So they worked on that. And then we also had another postdoc who was looking just on like general aridification of kind of some of these priority habitat areas that they thought they wanted to conserve. So that's kind of how we used some of our interviews and data in that situation. So this is kind of the next, like I said, like mile wide, 1 inch deep. So the evaporative demand drought index is a tool that we developed a couple years ago when I was working with some scientists at NOAA. It essentially measures kind of the thirst in the atmosphere. So really important when you're thinking about drought, particularly for things like flash drought that kind of happen really quickly. And so we wanted to, we designed the project to basically have iterative user engagement to figure out how people were kind of already using this really experimental project or product, but how we might be able to expand that to help other folks kind of in the drought space and use it. So we had kind of like tools, feedbacks, surveys, interviews, all that good fun. We tracked use cases. So again, like we had a pretty good handle on who was actually using it so we could reach out to them. And then we also kind of did some experimental projects and some beta testing with different people. One of the coolest things that we found is like, we were really able to use that information and that feedback from people to refine the content. So what we were actually feeding them, what information we had, but also the functionality of the website and the delivery method. So how we actually pushed this or provided this information to them. I'll do that. So again, this is kind of the full picture. This is actually the current conditions. I just pulled this off last night. So it's generated about once a week. Prior to this, the hydrologist was basically just generating this on demand for a bunch of different people for their particular regions and stuff like that. So it was a lot of work. So we automated a lot of that. And then it's kind of hard to see, but basically all of this stuff up here is all stuff that ended up getting added to the tool based on user feedback. They were like, we need a time series. We'd love to see an archive so we can go back and get stuff from, like previous weather events and things like that. So that really helped us kind of figure out how to make this information, this tool that we were packaging, useful and usable to the folks who were already, more usable to the folks who were already using it, and useful to an additional set of folks who might use it more in the future. And then some of the kind of lessons that we learned about producing useful and usable information from this, particularly as you're trying to transition something from a research product to an operational product, which for the National Weather Service, they have, it's all government. They have very, very strict standards and kind of a process to do so. So we strategically use the feedback to help us identify benchmarks and move this product along to be operational. You can talk to people and engage them at a lot of different points in the tool development process. It's not like if you didn't do it at the beginning, all is lost and you can't talk to anybody now because you had to do it at the beginning. No, you can bring them in at almost any time. And then the more interactions you have, the more feedback you have, you can really just kind of ramp up the usability of the product, but also just like teach people how to actually use the thing. Because that's one space that a lot of, we get it done and we just stop. And we forget that like, oh, we need like outreach and engagement to like train people about how to actually use the tool and how it fits into kind of the current universe of information that they're already using to make those things. So that's how we use qualitative research to kind of push that tool development and make it better. We had another project on state wildlife action plan. So here's a screenshot from the one in Wyoming.
Only 1,600 pages.
It's massive. And I read both the one from 2012 and the one from 2017. So, and we did it for 10 states. So that was really fun. But in the last round of revisions, which was kind of between around 2015, give or take a couple of years, depending on the state and the cycle, that was the first year that they were sort of, it was a soft mandate, I will say, to use climate information in those plans. Before it was just kind of completely optional, like nobody really mentioned it in the particular guidance of what you have to do. So because this was the first year, we wanted to look at how the different states actually use the information in their plans. So based on kind of the best practices and the guidance that all of the states had, we created sort of this rubric, this scoring system to score the plans. So we read a lot of plans. We only did 10 states because we only got so much time and our funding was very regionally focused. But yeah, so we scored all of the states and surprise, surprise to no one, that the states actually scored really, really differently. Some had a really, really savvy way to incorporate climate change and others didn't. And so as good social scientists, we wanted to know why. And so we talked to folks and we were like, why? What happened? So we interviewed people who were on the teams that kind of wrote the state wildlife action plans and just asked them. And so these are sort of, we found things that kind of helped, things that were sort of neutral, could go either way, depending on other contextual factors, and then things that really hindered the use of climate information in those plans. So not really surprising, additional funding to increase capacity. If you could hire a grad student, a postdoc, or even part of like at the time of a climate scientist to do that, it was really, really helpful. If you could take advantage of existing climate change vulnerability analysis tools like NatureServe, the mandate actually, when Congress basically said, you should really include, there was no like stick to not including climate change, but it was like, you should really include climate change in your plans and here's kind of how to do it. And so a lot of states said that if their teams were kind of otherwise resistant to doing so, either just because of capacity issues or limited time, that this was kind of the thing that sort of put them over the edge of like, yeah, okay, we should really be thinking about that. We were already thinking about it. Let's like officially think about it in a plan. if that makes sense. So that's really important because that means that this is a tool that can move the needle really, really quickly. If you just say, you've got to do it, then they do it. You tie money to it and then they'll do it. Professional networks that include climate folks in one state, the folks writing the plan were actually right down the hall from the state climatologist's office. So they could just walk back and forth and ask things. And surprise, surprise, they had a lot easier time integrating climate information into their plans than some of the other states that maybe didn't have those existing connections with the climate research community. I'm going to skip over the neutral stuff really quick for time, but conservative political climate was one of the biggest things that we heard that hindered the use of climate information in the plans. It wasn't necessarily the availability of the climate science, but it was people feeling like they might come under fire for using it openly and talking about climate change openly. Because the states that we were looking at, it was Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota. It's been a while since I wrote this paper, so I'm like trying to think. But so, you know, I mean, you guys kind of know that's a really interesting, like mixed region, right? And so one of my favorite quotes, like, we're not California or like one of those states, we can't just like throw this around. And so it's interesting because some people, they found like good, like interesting ways to sort of incorporate climate change or talk about it without actually talking about it. So saying things like hazard, increased variability, increased extremes, drought, things like that. And then this was actually, this quote was actually from one of the folks who was sort of at the national level, helping a lot of different states write their plans. And he was saying that like, just because they weren't necessarily saying the words climate change in their plan doesn't mean that they didn't have really, really great adaptation built into those plans at some times, like that it is possible to do it without even saying it. So I think that's also kind of an important lesson is that, because for some of these states, people that led those natural resource departments were political appointees and some are civil service. So that also, kind of makes a difference. If more funding helped, lack of funding didn't. That's not very surprising, but, and then this is one of my other kind of favorite findings from theirs that we summed it up as like too much information, but not enough of the right kind. So people are just awash in climate information and impacts information, but it often just doesn't fit their needs. It's not at the right scale, it's not at the right time, it's not compatible with their existing decision-making tools, things like that. So, and I think that that's really interesting because that points to, you know, we don't necessarily need a new model or a new downscale model or a new projection. We might just need better guidance and translational information of how to actually use that and apply it. And then this is what people wanted. They would love to see case studies where other states have actually done this kind of thing successfully. They don't have time to read each other's 1,600-page plans. They would love to know what has worked for other states. They can actually use the vulnerability analysis from different states if they're talking about the same species, particularly obviously their neighboring states, that helps. Yeah. For time. But this kind of gets back to one of our bigger questions of like, does adaptation planning actually lead to adaptation? We really, really hope it does, right? Didn't and shouldn't we know if that was the case? So again, kind of getting back to some of those bigger research questions. How am I?
12:27.
Okay,
That's
so
good.
we're doing good.
Great.
All right, so grassland synthesis project. This is one of our more recent projects. It was about a 3-year project. I was the PI, and it was through the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is here, so that you guys actually know what I'm talking about. So this is kind of the region that we look at. The casks, as we call them, are a network of centers across the country that are funded by USGS and housed at universities. And our whole mission is really to do actionable and usable science for DOI related agencies, so public land management agencies like National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM. Sometimes we get to play with Forest Service, not as much as we want, but they're in USDA, so it's a little fuzzy sometimes. We get to hang out with the folks at the Hub, the Northern Plains Climate Hub every once in a while. So if you know Nell Peck and Wendy Kelly, we love playing in the sandbox with them. But yeah, so as we were looking at the science that we were doing, at the CASC, we realized that we had a lot of really good connections with managers in the national parks. We did a lot of research in kind of the montane and alpine ecosystems. We hadn't done as much in the whole eastern portion of our region. And if you look back at this map, there's a ton of grass in these regions, right? We all know this. So we knew that we wanted to kind of plug into that space. And just because we weren't paying attention to it, it didn't mean that there wasn't already a lot of really awesome work going on. So the synthesis project was really to kind of synthesize existing information and create a baseline so we could understand the best place for the CASC to kind of plug in. So we pulled a lot from the available data, a lot of research that people are just asking, like, I don't know, do you ever like send a thing to a manager and you're like, tell us what you need? Like, we're sending out a questionnaire. And we didn't necessarily want to do that because there's already so many people doing great research on that. So we synthesized the peer-reviewed literature about that was available. We also looked at the management plans and adaptation plans from a bunch of these different agencies that were involved in grassland management. Because again, if you know enough about the context, you can kind of read between the lines to figure out what kind of climate and ecological information might be helpful to these folks as they're trying to manage grassland ecosystems for climate change. And we also wanted to reduce stakeholder fatigue. So I didn't want to send out another survey if someone had already done that, right? We can figure out what hasn't been done yet and kind of plug in there. And this, I'm going to focus mostly on the needs assessment part of this project. But we did end up, we had to change because COVID happened in the middle of all of this. But we ended up having kind of two working groups. So the first working group was really to kind of understand the management context of grassland managers across the region. So what they were trying to do, what their goals were, what their primary challenges were, what they were really thinking about, what kept them up at night when they're worrying about climate change in grasslands. And then we used that to inform our kind of second working group, which was to synthesize available ecological and climate information that would help answer some of those questions. And then the ones that were left over are the places that we're going to try to plug in the future. So we really wanted to start with the managers. This is basically here as placeholders for me. If you all have questions about methods later, we will come back to this. But so we have these two massive reports that are, as I was complaining to Drew, are stuck somewhere in USGS copy editing. And they've had them for almost 2 years now. So we're hoping that they will come out at some point. But really, some of the really cool stuff we did in the first report. So we wanted to look at sort of, again, the management context. So what are these grassland managers even trying to do? So, you know, that looks different if it's a state agency versus a tribal nation versus the National Park Service, et cetera, right? And so we found kind of 15 major buckets of questions that if we could answer them would really help grassland managers adapt to climate change and manage these systems as they continue to change. And then we took it a little bit further and we broke these questions down. Sorry, let me back up. So these ranged anywhere from like where grass is most likely to be lost, all the way to a lot more social sciencey questions like how can we incentivize grassland conservation on private lands, like things like policy changes, et cetera. And then we got more specific. We broke those down. So it's not just where are you likely to lose grasslands, but it's really like how is cropland going to expand? Sorry, no, this is really small. How is rangeland going to change? Because that looks very different from a conservation perspective. If you're worried about birds, row crops versus rangeland, very different. Thinking about suburban and urban development, et cetera. So really kind of trying to break this down and still keep it applicable broadly to grassland managers in the region. And then while we didn't do extensive surveys with them, we spot checked these and kind of gave them this list and said, gut check us. Does this seem right to you? Are we totally off? Are we missing anything? So we iterated with them on this list of 70 questions that we got. And then we asked them to tell us, are these questions highly relevant, somewhat relevant, or not at all relevant to your agency? So, you know, for example, like Forest Service, losing grasslands is only somewhat relevant because a lot of the grasslands they manage are public, like they're like national grasslands. So they're not really, that's like not going to get like plowed under or something like that. In the same way that Fish and Wildlife Service is very concerned about it, because a lot of the work they're doing is managing species on privately owned grasslands, right? That lots of different things can happen to. So yeah, and so the idea is for like, if you're a researcher who's trying to kind of plug in and support grassland managers, this is kind of a quick primer, really, to help you think, what kind of questions should I be asking? What kind of research do I want to do that might really help them? And how relevant is it to them? Or like, if I'm really interested in thinking about how conservation funds can be used to prevent grassland conversion, maybe I really want to work with people from Fish and Wildlife, with NRCS and, I don't know, pick one, like one of the states, right? Like Wyoming Game and Fish, that kind of thing. So this first report is really geared towards the management or the research community, because the managers, they already know this, right? And so then we took this a little bit further, and we're saying, well, if you were trying to put together interdisciplinary teams to answer these questions, because they are highly interdisciplinary, and at least half of them have a major social science component, then these are the kind of folks from these disciplines that you might want to pull into your team to try to answer this question comprehensively. So we did that as well. We're just like repackaging this info in all different ways. If you don't care about any of that context and all you want to see is like our list of questions, the agencies and other entities that we were thinking about, and then if it's highly, somewhat, or not at all relevant, then you can just go straight to here and just download a table. That's all you got. That's all you have to do. We also use this to do a grasslands and climate training for Fish and Wildlife Service, because they were really trying to build climate literacy with some of their managers. And so we used kind of the priorities that we learned, or the stuff that we learned about from the management priorities report and some of those research questions to inform what we were doing in this training. And then last but not least, I didn't talk much about the climate and ecology report, but we did use all of those research questions and research needs to inform how and what information we synthesized for the climate and the ecological information. And so we're in the process of kind of summarizing key findings from those into the kind of these flashy 2-pagers. So they're like quick and easily digestible for the management community, so they don't have to read a 300+ page report that is still not available because it is hiding in USGS. I shouldn't say that too loud. They're doing their best. They just have a whole lot on their plate. So
just time check, it's 12:35.
Okay.
Yeah, so,
thank you.
Yeah.
I'm right on. See, I read through it at least twice, so
yes.
thank you. But yeah, so the next steps in this, we had planned to synthesize the climate and ecological information. I feel weird saying this as the social scientist and the PI on the team. We did not plan to synthesize the social science information. I was surprised at how much social science came out in the stated needs and in our big review. So we actually had some students working with us this summer to kind of rectify this. And so that work is forthcoming. Hopefully we'll have some really cool annotated bibliographies and stuff in the near future. There's that. We also need to work with tribal members more. As I mentioned, COVID basically blew up all of our outreach and engagement plans. We had plans to do a lot of in-person work with some of the tribal nations in our region, and that obviously couldn't happen. This project basically started in January of 2020. So yeah, that's kind of self-explanatory. So tribal nations are not represented in this report in the way that we want, with the depth and the nuance that's needed. So that's definitely a space where we want to go in the future. And then, as always, kind of continuing collaboration between the research community and the management community through things like those trainings and stuff like that. And then this is the last project that I wanted to talk to you about. So this is ongoing. We are currently doing the interviews and analyzing the data for this. So I don't even have initial findings to tell you, but it's really cool and we're really excited about it. And Corey Knapp was part of some of the work that inspired this, so I felt like it was particularly relevant. So here's the paper that came out from some colleagues and Corey a couple years ago, thinking about the non-data, the non-climate information things that go into making adaptation decisions, right? Because it's not just about the available climate science or applying the climate science. We're people, we're complex. We have lots of other things going on in our brains and our lives and our hearts when we're making big decisions about things like, are we gonna really fight to keep sequoias in Sequoia National Park? Things like that. Those are pretty heavy sometimes. So this is from their paper. So thinking about kind of these mental models and like all of those non-science things that feed into decision-making. And so we really wanted to think about how do emotions, and just build on that word, how emotions and institutional context influence that decision-making. There's a lot of work on the institutional context part, not as much on the emotions. So that's where we really wanted to delve into. So we're working with partners at 4 different national parks, Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Acadia, Northern Cascades, and then Glacier. Glacier's cool because we're also working with the Confederated Salish Kootenai, which is one of the tribal nations that's located close to the park. And that's actually the one that I know the most about because that's the one I'm leading. I am not doing the interviews. I don't get to go to all those other awesome national parks. I really wish I did, but not yet. And one of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about is, and I should back up. Are you all familiar with the Resist, Accept, Direct? Okay, I see some nods either way. So let me just back up and say what that actually is. So Resist, Accept, Direct, or RAD, is kind of a decision-making paradigm that's gaining a lot of traction in like Fish and Wildlife Service and also in the National Park Service. And it's basically saying that as you're looking at, as climate change is happening, and you've got a lot of ecological change going on because of that, you can do one of 3 things. You can really resist the change and just kind of fight against it as much as you can. You can accept the change and just say, it's gonna happen. There it goes. Or you can direct the change. You can say, well, we think that based on what those future projections look like, those future scenarios, that are the place that we're managing is going to go kind of in one of 3 ways. We want it to go, it could go 1, 2, or 3. We want it to go in like track number 2. So we're going to make our management decisions like seed, like replanting after fires, or like seed. My words are failing me here. The seeds that you're, yeah, like the reseed, like the species you're choosing for like reseeding and restoration. Thank you. You can kind of pick or kind of direct that change. So that's kind of the idea, is that you can kind of go on one of those 3 pathways. And you have to obviously make those decisions multiple times over time as things continue to change. But this is kind of one of the ways they're thinking about it. If you're familiar with the Forest Service, it's similar to the, is it RTT or RRT? They kind of have a similar way of thinking about how to adaptively manage these changes. So that's what we're looking at, is we basically want to know. So like as we have like different changing fire regimes in Sequoia Kings Canyon, and we're like seeing really low recruitment of sequoias, how do the managers there decide, are they just going to let that happen? Are they going to fight against it and keep planting the trees in the same space? Or are they going to maybe direct it and say, no, we're actually going to plant trees in a different place that we think might be a more sustainable place for those trees to be in the long run? For a very quick example, don't like hold me to that. But we're really interested in, I am really interested in the procedural justice aspect of this, of like, who gets to decide that? Who gets to decide when you walk away from a stand of trees? You say, we're not going to replant these anymore. Or in Glacier, you know, like we're just going to abandon white bark pine because we just don't think it'll be able to persist on the landscape. Who gets to decide those things? Who gets to sit at the table and make those decisions? Whose values are we thinking about when we're deciding that? And what does that kind of mean? And, you know, what is the role of kind of different publics outside of the national park staff, even outside of the tribal resource managers who are managing some of these spaces? The public like us who want to enjoy those things, or like people that live nearby, those kind of values, and how all of those sort of come together in this really complicated space to make those decisions. So again, we're really excited about this one, and it is ongoing. So maybe if I come back in like 2 years, I'll have some cool like stuff to say, and like Corey and I can chat about that. So yeah, so like I said, kind of a mile wide and an inch deep on a couple of different projects that we've been able to use like qualitative social science methods to hopefully kind of make information more actionable and more usable, to think about how we might study that and kind of make that better and how we might actively evaluate adaptation. So yeah, there's my questions.
We have about 7 minutes until 12:50 for questions, and I imagine Heather's able to stick around for those that are able to stick around after 12:50 for more conversation. So turn over questions.
Seems like communication is a really big part of the work that you do, and I'm wondering how that factored into your education, or like how did you learn to communicate effectively in these different spaces with these different stakeholders and managers and all these people?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I will say that we rely a lot on a fantastic communications team to do the stuff that like they think about that all day, every day. But I think it's a really important thing for any folks who are trying to do science and trying to get it out, into the broader impacts and wider community. One thing for me has honestly been, we were talking about this earlier, my methods class was really a methodologies class way back in grad school. And it really talked a lot about, kind of you as a researcher and your positionality and how that impacts how you do research, how you think about research, how you analyze and talk about, like distill findings from your research. And a lot of that has to do with kind of understanding like history and power dynamics and stuff like that. And so I will say that that has been invaluable because I can go in a room and I can understand the power dynamics that exist between employees at Glacier National Park and tribal resource managers at CSKT. And those are very different, right? There are very different histories in those places. So honestly, kind of understanding a lot of that bigger context, which is a really big part of my like background in education and training, has really helped just sort of understand the whole situation. And then I think it helps to bring kind of those disparate parties together when you have a better understanding of that. There's also been a lot of really good kind of like science communication workshops. I feel like that's one of those things that it just keeps growing and growing at some of the national meetings or even probably at your university. I know we run some through the CASP to help folks communicate their science to kind of get you the actual like the last little bit. What I was talking about before is kind of like all that background bit that really, really matters, but isn't necessarily what we think of immediately when we think of communications.
Do you have, so I know your team is really interdisciplinary. Is there like a core group of players that you're typically working with? Like, I would imagine a climate scientist, like, yeah, who are you usually working with?
Yeah, there's 3 of us. There's myself, we have a social science lead, a climate science lead, and then we are in the process of onboarding an ecologist for like our ecological science impacts lead. And so kind of the 3 of us are that. We also have a ton of other, obviously, awesome other ecologists and other social scientists and other climate people and hydrologists and stuff that we work with. But we're sort of the 3 that sit. And like right now, we're actually writing our rebid proposal for the center to host it again for another 5 years. So we're thinking a lot about how all of these big science pieces and then little actionable operational science pieces come together. So.
And just for those that are on Zoom, if you want to raise your hand in the Zoom room and I can either call you out if you want to ask your question directly or feel free just to type in the chat if you have a question. I think Brent had a question. So.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of the issues here are transboundary issues across jurisdiction. So did you look at the relationship between, let's say, an agency or an entity and what they care about and their actual ability to address it in the area that, so as an example, the tribes have lost tons of sovereignty, yes. Right? So the land base over which they can make decisions is really small. So they may have concerns about things where they used to be able to make management decisions, but they can no longer. Or it could be the opposite direction where, private landowners, like I have ultimate authority over this chunk of land, but it's actually really small. So just curious about those kind of transboundary management issues.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to do as much work or research on that. It came out from our grasslands management project, a map that we showed or that I didn't show that we generated for this was basically to try to kind of just map who sort of has jurisdiction over the grasslands in our region. We did it at a pretty large scale. But you know, there was a really great study that came out on like Weld County, which is the county right next to mine, Boulder County. My city is halfway in Weld County. And it's where the Pawnee National Grasslands are. And just looking at the patchwork of ownership in just that tiny little county level is amazing. And the really interesting, galling, juicy, I don't know, however you want to say it, there's a lot there. Problem or opportunity with that is that sometimes those management agencies or entities are right next to each other and they have completely opposite missions and goals. And so, for example, like you might have several organizations and agencies working together to conserve black-tailed prairie dog on those spaces. And they've worked really hard to build those interagency agreements to do so. And then right next to it, you have land run by a different agency. I'm trying to be really judicious here. That pays, that kills them, that extirpates it as soon as they cross that boundary, right? And so that's just one little example, but no, you point to a really kind of wicked problem in some of these spaces, especially as we're trying to think a lot about like connectivity and landscape scale conservation for some of these migratory species and stuff.
And Becky does have her hand up in the Zoom room if you want to ask your question, Becky.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thanks. I really appreciated the talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah, do you want to?
You have like sound inception now.
Becky, 1 second. Let me see if we can turn your speakers on here.
The Zoom camera like there? Is it there?
It's not that one.
That one? Okay.
Yeah. So, Becky, maybe if you try typing your question, sorry.
It's okay. No problem. Can
You
you?
want to ask while she's doing?
I suspect she's gonna be quick.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to hear more about how you're speaking back to funders. You know, your insight about more science alone isn't necessarily, and then so are you presenting an alternative vision? And then what's your message from your center to funding agencies about what we really need to fund as projects that have these things? Is there any of that with your center's work?
Yeah, so one of the really great things about being involved with the Climate Adaptation Science Center is that's kind of their whole shtick, which is really great. For the first couple years of my career, I worked in a very different unit on campus where that was not the thing. Like they would always kind of, I think there's such a tension between trying to talk about broader impacts and how folks are always like, broader impacts, it's so important, but we're not really interested in funding it, and we're not really interested if that's mostly what you're doing. That's kind of like the add-on of the science that we do. And that's kind of, it feels like that's kind of the traditional model in some ways. With things like the Climate Adaptation Science Center, it's really great because they try, we're working on it and we're getting better, I hope. We're moving in the right direction on this, of flipping that and saying like, if it's not actionable or usable, we don't want it. Like the CASC doesn't fund tool development if it's not in very close collaboration with an existing agency or an existing partner. And you often have to articulate the direct connection to those people, and they're often listed as collaborators and funded on those same grants. Obviously you can't fund feds, but you know what I mean? Like we fund the partners as we can. And so I think it's been really nice to work in that space. I don't think it's not where I would love to see it yet, but like I said, I hope we're moving slowly in that direction more and more. So, and I think as it becomes more established in that little piece of USGS, that maybe it will become, we can, you know, take those lessons and kind of apply them in other places and make it easier to kind of sell that to funders in the future.
So Becky, I apologize. We're having tech issues getting you to come through here. If you wouldn't mind typing your question, would be great if you're able to do that. And I know we're at 12, we'll pass 12:50 for those that have other obligations after this. If you need to get up and head out, please feel free to do so, but we'll just hopefully we can get Becky's question in here before we wrap up, but maybe if there's one more question in the room. I have a question I'm curious about. As a social scientist working in interdisciplinary efforts, I feel like oftentimes it's like an afterthought, or it's like, hey, we've got this proposal we're putting in. It's due in 2 days. Could you add the like social sciencey thing? And you're like, wait, what? Or there's this like, oh, you're a social scientist. Will you figure us how to like, we're gonna do the science and then we'll figure out, like, can you just tell us how to like communicate it out to the people we want? Like, how do you balance that? Like, how do you make it where the social science is maybe a little bit more integrated or a key part of the, on par, I guess, with the other aspects of the science?
That is a really great question. I think it still comes up literally all the time. The cooperative institute that I work, that the series, which is kind of like the overarching, it's all very complicated and weird, and I won't get into it, but that overarching thing, there's almost 900 scientists in there, kind of across the university. There are about 8 social scientists in all of that. Yeah, very often I still get calls of like, the grant proposal is due in 2 weeks. We need a tribal partner. And I'm like, friend, we had to start that work a year and a half ago to make a connection, you know? And so it is an ongoing thing. I think the only thing we can do is kind of point to things like the EDDI tool that we did. One of the reasons that we got the funding to move that from research to operations was because we had an integrated social science component from the beginning. I was sitting in the room from the day we started writing that grant. And then we were able, like I said, to kind of tie that the work we were doing with the users and the potential users and the social science stuff that we were doing, that granted it's very applied social science, right? But we were able to tie that to the particular benchmarks and show how that was a vital tool and a vital method to move through the requirements and meet the deliverables of that particular thing. And so that's one of the projects that we have kind of held up of like, look how different this looks than some of the other projects where it was kind of like add social science or communications at the end and stir. And yeah, so that's what we try to do.
Thanks. And maybe the last question, and we'll wrap up, is from Becky Wittenock-Huber. She asked, building on what Brent and Wes just asked, how do you manage the different priorities of communities versus funders and academia, specifically different temporal goals and understandings of natural resources? And how does that influence your interpretation of what an impact is and means and how that is sustainable through time?
Oh my gosh, that is amazing. We could have talked the whole hour about that exact question. I would love to talk for an hour about that.
Next seminar, we'll schedule
I feel like we would probably all need a support group of like, what little things have you done that have chipped away at this problem? It is a perpetual problem. A lot of these couldn't even, we're trying to find funding right now to go back to some of these projects and be like, did you ever use that predictive May pond count model, prairie potholes people? Did you ever, like, now that Eddie's been around for, you know, a couple of years, how are you still using it? Can we make it better? Is it better than any of the other tools that we developed in other ways? Yeah, that is literally a perpetual problem. I don't have a good answer to it. And like I said, right now we are walking around with our grant hands out, trying to find funding that would inform some of that. And kind of on the flip side, we're working particularly with the last project that I talked about. And sorry, I know we're at time, so I'm going to make this really quick. But the RAD project, that took a ton of relationship building for almost a year and a half before we were able to get those folks to be partners on this project. It was co-developed with the park managers at those parks and with the folks at CSKT. And we're really proud of that. None of that was explicitly paid for. It's like all of the way that you kind of borrow from like other grant and other time sources that you can find and cobble together stuff to actually make those relationships happen. And we're trying to actually think of a way to communicate that and like wrap that up with like, what does it actually take and how might we be able to fund those kind of ventures in the future so that we can end up with projects like this. Yeah, so I would love to talk to you more about that, Becky.
Or maybe connect over a cocktail and
Yeah, I think you can keep some beer.
Yeah, exactly. Beer conversation. Well, join me in thanking Heather for making it here. So
Thank you all very much. I appreciate your time and your great questions.
thanks for joining on Zoom.